The heat had glued Elaine Parker's shirt to her back before the sun even rose. She blinked into the gray morning and realized the steering wheel was her pillow again. Her neck ached with the dull reminder that this wasn't a nap, it was a life. The gas station lights hummed like tired insects above the empty pumps, and the quiet felt too big for a woman trying to pretend she still belonged somewhere. A truck rumbled past on the highway, dragging sound across the flat Texas dark. Elaine flinched as if the noise could expose her, like a spotlight ripping off a disguise. She kept her eyes low, watching dust settle on the dashboard in slow surrender. Her phone screen stayed black because no one was calling, and she knew it. Still, she held it for a moment, just to feel the lie of possibility in her palm. The car smelled like old coffee, warm plastic, and the faint sting of yesterday's tears. She turned the key halfway to crack the window, then stopped, afraid of wasting battery. Every choice now felt like a survival math problem she was too tired to solve. She counted quarters in the cup holder, not because she needed to, but because it calmed her. Numbers didn't judge her the way memory did. Across the lot, a man in a red cap hosed down the concrete by the store entrance. Water spread in thin rivers, catching the fluorescent light like moving glass. Elaine watched him without thinking, like watching someone else's normal life on a screen. He looked up once, briefly, and she turned away fast, heart kicking against her ribs. Invisible was safer, even when invisibility started to feel like dying. She remembered the last night in her house, the way the closet echoed after she emptied it. She remembered the click of the lock, the smell of lemon cleaner, and the silence afterward. She had told herself she'd stay with a friend for a few days, just until things settled. But things didn't settle, they scattered, and she had chased them until she had nothing left. Now she lived inside a moving box with 4 doors and a steering wheel. Elaine rubbed her arms, not from cold, but from that creeping sense of being watched by fate. She opened the glove compartment and stared at the folded divorce papers like they were a curse. The inked signatures looked too calm for what they had done to her life. She slid the papers back, as if hiding them could undo them, as if hiding could heal. Her throat tightened, but she refused to cry, because tears felt like spending money she didn't have. When she finally stepped out, the air hit her like a damp towel pulled from a dryer. Her legs felt stiff, embarrassed to exist in public after a night curled in a front seat. She walked toward the restroom with her keys clenched like a weapon. Every step said, "You are here, and you don't know what comes next." And behind that thought, softer but sharper, came another one she couldn't silence. Inside the restroom, the lights were too bright, and the mirror was too honest. Elaine stared at her own face and saw a stranger wearing her features like a mask. The lines near her mouth looked deeper, as if grief had been carving in the dark. She ran water and pressed wet paper towels to her cheeks, trying to feel awake. But wakefulness only meant remembering, and remembering was the real punishment. The divorce hadn't been one explosive fight, it had been a slow disappearance. Months of speaking through clenched teeth, weeks of eating in silence, days of separate rooms. She could still hear the television murmuring while they pretended it was company. She could still feel the cold space in their bed, wide as a canyon at midnight. Some endings arrive like storms, but hers arrived like dust, quiet and relentless. On the final day, the lawyer's office had smelled like stale carpet and cheap coffee. Elaine had held a pen and waited for her hand to stop shaking enough to sign. Her husband hadn't looked at her, not even once, as if eye contact would cost him something. When the papers were done, he stood up first, already moving toward a new life. And she sat there a few seconds longer, because her body didn't know how to leave. She thought she would be angry, and she was, but anger wasn't the strongest thing. The strongest thing was the emptiness that followed her like a shadow with no owner. It settled in her chest when she tried to eat, and it tightened her throat when she tried to talk. Her friends had said, "You'll be okay," in voices that sounded like closing doors. Elaine nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining she didn't recognize herself anymore. In the car, she had packed what made sense and abandoned what made her feel weak. Photos went into a box, then into storage, then out of her life without ceremony. The wedding album stayed behind because touching it felt like touching a wound. Her mother's old recipe cards came with her, stained with vanilla and thyme, because they felt safe. She built her new world from whatever didn't break her fingers to hold. Now, looking in the mirror, she whispered her own name like it might anchor her. "Elaine," she said, and the sound bounced back thin, almost unfamiliar. She tried to remember what she loved before she became someone's wife and someone's helper. The answer didn't come quickly, and that scared her more than being alone. If she couldn't name herself, what exactly had she saved all these years? She left the restroom with her shoulders squared, like posture could be a shield. Outside, the world kept moving, cruelly steady, as if her life hadn't just collapsed. She watched a woman laugh beside a minivan, keys jingling, sunlight in her hair. A simple scene, nothing dramatic, but it hit Elaine like a bruise being pressed, and she felt the first flicker of a question she wasn't ready to ask. Elaine sat on the curb near the side of the building, pretending she was just resting. Her car was parked a little farther away, angled so the windshield didn't face the store. She had learned how to arrange herself like furniture, present but not noticed. Every time the door chimed, she braced for eyes that might look too long. She was 52, and she had never felt so small inside her own skin. A group of men in dusty boots walked out with snacks and loud voices. Their laughter filled the air like it belonged to them, like permission they didn't have to earn. Elaine's stomach tightened, because laughter reminded her of rooms she used to enter without fear. She wondered if they could tell, if homelessness had a scent, a posture, a shadow. She tugged her shirt down and wished she could shrink into the concrete. The Texas morning grew hotter, and the sky turned that hard blue that offered no mercy. The asphalt smelled like baked tar, and heat shimmered above it like an accusation. Elaine wiped sweat from her upper lip and tasted salt, as if her body was grieving outward. She watched families load their trunks, kids swinging their legs, mothers counting bottles of water. They were preparing for a trip, and she was preparing for survival. In her head, shame spoke in a voice that sounded like her ex-husband on tired evenings. It said she should have been smarter, should have kept quiet, should have accepted less. It said she had made her bed, and now she should lie in it, even if that bed was a backseat. Elaine clenched her jaw until it hurt, because anger felt cleaner than surrender. Yet anger also scared her, because it was proof she still wanted something. She stood and walked along the side wall, where a vending machine buzzed softly. The machine's glass showed her reflection in pieces, broken by rows of candy bars. Her eyes looked alert in a way she didn't remember, like an animal listening for danger. She pressed her forehead briefly to the cool metal, craving anything that didn't feel like fire. Then she pulled back, embarrassed by her own need for comfort. When she opened her car door, the smell inside wrapped around her again, too intimate. She sat in the driver's seat and let her hands rest on the wheel, as if she still had direction. A passing car slowed for a moment, and her heart raced, convinced it was law enforcement or pity. But it kept going, and the relief left her shaky, like adrenaline with nowhere to land. She realized she was living in constant alert, and her body was paying the price. Somewhere beneath the shame, something else stirred, quieter but more stubborn. It wasn't optimism, not yet, and it wasn't bravery, not the kind in movies. It was a refusal, a small internal voice saying, "This cannot be the only ending." Elaine didn't know where that voice came from, but she didn't silence it this time. And that tiny act of listening changed the air around her, almost imperceptibly. Night returned, like a blanket dropped without kindness, heavy and humid and close. Elaine waited until the parking lot thinned out, until most cars were gone, and the highway softened. She reclined her seat, just enough to rest, but not enough to feel vulnerable. The radio stayed off, because silence felt safer than songs that might make her cry. Then a knock came on her window, gentle, careful, as if asking permission to exist. Elaine's breath caught, and her fingers tightened around her keys like claws. Outside stood the man from earlier, the one in the red cap, holding a small paper bag. He didn't lean in, didn't crowd her, didn't look at her like she was a problem to solve. He simply raised the bag slightly, then lowered his hand, waiting for her to decide. That restraint felt like respect, and respect felt unfamiliar. She cracked the window a few inches, just enough to speak without opening her world. "What do you want?" she asked, hating how sharp her voice sounded in the dark. The man nodded once, as if he understood the fear behind the words. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm closing up soon, and I had some extra sandwiches." His accent was local, warm, and his tone carried no performance. Elaine wanted to refuse, because accepting meant admitting something out loud. But her stomach betrayed her with a low, aching emptiness that made dignity feel like a luxury. She hesitated, eyes flicking to his hands, to the store, to the empty lot around them. He stayed still, the bag hanging lightly, offering without insisting. Finally, she whispered, "How much?" The man's eyebrows lifted, and he shook his head as if the question didn't fit. "Nothing," he said, and then he added, "I've been there in my own way." Elaine felt something twist inside her chest, a knot loosening without permission. She opened the door just a little and took the bag, careful not to touch his fingers. The paper was warm, and for a second warmth felt like being held. He stepped back, giving her space, and glanced toward the highway like he was measuring time. "Name's Curtis," he said, voice calm, like he wasn't asking for anything in return. Elaine swallowed hard, embarrassed by the sudden sting in her eyes. "I'm Elaine," she managed, and her own name sounded softer than it had all day. Curtis nodded, as if that name mattered, as if she mattered. As he walked away, Elaine unwrapped the sandwich with hands that trembled slightly. The smell of bread and mustard filled her car, grounding her in something simple and real. She took a bite and felt her body sigh, not with joy, but with relief. Then the tears came anyway, hot and quiet, sliding down her face without drama. And in that small kindness, she felt the first crack in the wall she'd built to survive. Elaine woke before dawn, the paper bag folded neatly beside her, like proof it happened. Outside, the sky was still dark, but the horizon carried a faint ribbon of pale light. She sat up slowly, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel instantly panicked. The kindness from last night lingered like a scent, subtle but present in her thoughts. It made her wonder what else she had forgotten about people and about herself. She chewed a piece of leftover bread and let the texture settle her nerves. In the distance, a lone bird called out, the sound sharp against the quiet morning. Elaine closed her eyes, and memory rose uninvited, not of the divorce, but of a younger voice. She saw herself at 23, hair pinned up, hands stained with paint from a community mural. She remembered laughing with strangers, fearless in a way she hadn't been in decades. Back then, she believed life could be shaped, like clay warmed between determined palms. She had wanted to travel, wanted to open a small shop, wanted to teach art to kids after school. The dreams weren't grand, but they were hers, and that ownership had made her glow. Somewhere along the way, she traded glowing for stability, then traded stability for silence. Now she realized she hadn't just lost a marriage, she had slowly misplaced herself. The thought hurt more than hunger, because it carried responsibility, and responsibility carried regret. Elaine pressed her fingertips to her temple, as if she could hold the ache in place. She thought of every time she said it's fine when it wasn't, every time she minimized her own needs. She thought of holidays she hosted like a performance, smiling while her insides begged to sit down. Her life had been busy, but it hadn't always been alive. She stepped out of the car and felt the coolness before sunrise brush her arms. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and damp earth, like the land itself exhaling after heat. Elaine walked to the edge of the lot and watched headlights streak by, each one going somewhere. She put a hand over her heart and tried to imagine a destination that wasn't just a way. The idea felt fragile, like a newborn animal she didn't know how to carry. Curtis came out briefly to throw away trash, and when he saw her, he raised 2 fingers in greeting. No pity, no questions, just a simple acknowledgement that didn't demand an explanation. Elaine lifted her hand back, and the motion surprised her with how normal it felt. Normal, not because her situation was normal, but because she was being treated as human. That small exchange made her chest tighten again, but this time it wasn't only pain. As the sky brightened, Elaine returned to her car and sat with both hands on the wheel. She didn't start the engine right away, because for once she wasn't running on pure reflex. She listened to the quiet inside her, to the echo of old dreams tapping at a locked door. Something in her whispered that the woman from the mural was still in there, waiting. And Elaine realized the road might not just be where she hid, but where she began. Elaine lay back in the driver's seat as night pressed in again, heavier than before. The sounds of the highway blended into a low, restless hum that never truly stopped. Her eyes closed, but her mind stayed alert, scanning the dark for danger or regret. Fear had become her closest companion, curling beside her without asking. And tonight, she finally admitted she was exhausted from pretending not to feel it. Every small noise pulled her halfway awake, heart jumping like it had forgotten rest. She imagined worst-case endings the way some people imagine vacations. A knock that wasn't kind, a tow truck, a voice telling her to move along. She held her breath during each passing set of headlights, counting seconds. Sleep came in fragments, thin and unsatisfying, like borrowed time. In those half-dreams she saw doors closing just as she reached them. A house she couldn't enter, a room where her voice wouldn't carry. She woke with her jaw clenched, fingers numb from gripping the seatbelt. The fear wasn't only about safety, she realized, but about direction. She had no map, and fear hated uncertainty more than pain. At some point before dawn, Elaine whispered into the dark, "I don't know where to go." The words felt dangerous, like admitting weakness to an enemy. But nothing terrible happened after she said them. The world didn't collapse, and the car didn't disappear beneath her. Instead, the confessions settled, quiet and honest, inside her chest. She realized she had spent years pretending certainty was strength. She stayed in a marriage long after love faded because leaving felt irresponsible. She accepted less joy because it looked stable from the outside. Now, certainty was gone, and all that remained was truth. And truth, while terrifying, felt strangely clean. As the sky lightened, Elaine felt something new beneath the fear. Not confidence, not hope, but permission to be unfinished. She had no answers, but she was still breathing, still choosing. For the first time, not knowing didn't feel like failure. It felt like standing at the edge of something unnamed. She sat up slowly as morning arrived, stiff and unsure but present. Fear hadn't left her, but it had shifted, making room for something else. She placed both feet on the ground outside the car and inhaled deeply. "I'm still here," she said softly, testing the weight of the words. And fear listened, but it didn't win. Curtis handed her a cup of coffee without ceremony, like it was the most natural thing. Elaine hesitated, then wrapped her hands around the warm paper cup. The heat seeped into her palms, loosening something tight and old. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone offered without expecting. That realization made her throat ache more than hunger ever had. They didn't sit together, didn't share a dramatic conversation. Curtis leaned against the wall, sipping his own coffee, eyes on the horizon. The space between them felt respectful, intentional, safe. Elaine appreciated that he didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Silence, in this moment, felt like kindness. She took a sip and winced at the bitterness, then smiled, despite herself. Real coffee, not gas station water disguised as comfort. It reminded her of early mornings years ago, rushing to work with purpose. Back when being tired meant being needed, not being lost. The memory stung, but it also warmed her. Curtis eventually spoke, voice casual, almost shy. "They're looking for help at the diner down the road," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's honest work." Elaine nodded slowly, as if he'd handed her a fragile object. A possibility, small enough not to scare her away. After he left, Elaine sat alone with the coffee cooling in her hands. Her armor, built from pride and fear, showed tiny cracks now. Accepting help hadn't erased her dignity like she thought it would. Instead, it reminded her she was allowed to receive. That realization unsettled her in the best possible way. She thought about the diner, about walking in and asking. The idea made her stomach twist, shame quickening her pulse. But beneath that shame was a quieter excitement she barely recognized. Movement, even small, meant she wasn't frozen anymore. And frozen was the one thing she refused to be. Elaine stood, smoothed her shirt, and looked down the road. The diner sign flickered in the distance, modest and unpromising. She didn't commit to anything yet, not out loud. But inside, something leaned forward instead of shrinking back. And that shift, though invisible, changed her posture entirely. Elaine drove past the diner once, without stopping. Her hands shook slightly on the steering wheel as she told herself she was just looking. The parking lot was half full, nothing dramatic, nothing welcoming either. She felt the old instinct to keep moving, to avoid the risk of rejection. Running had become second nature, polished by years of avoidance. She circled the block, heart pounding louder than the engine. A voice inside urged her to leave town before she got attached. Attachment meant disappointment, and disappointment felt unbearable right now. But another voice, quieter and steadier, asked what she was really afraid of. The answer wasn't failure, but being seen. Elaine parked across the street and turned off the engine. Silence flooded the car, thick with decision. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes. If she drove away now, no one would blame her. But she would know, and that knowledge would follow her. She stepped out of the car and felt the sun on her face. The heat no longer felt hostile, just present. Each step toward the diner felt heavier than the last. Her legs wanted to turn back, but she kept going anyway. This wasn't bravery, she realized. It was refusal to disappear. Inside, the diner smelled like grease, coffee, and routine. A bell chimed as she entered, announcing her existence. Several heads turned, then turned away, uninterested. The lack of scrutiny surprised her. She wasn't special here, and that made it easier to breathe. She approached the counter, voice barely steady. "I heard you might need help," she said. The woman behind the counter looked her over, practical and tired. "Can you start today?" she asked, already reaching for a notepad. Elaine nodded before fear could interrupt. As she stepped back outside to wait, Elaine felt something settle. She hadn't solved her life, hadn't fixed the past, but she had chosen to stay instead of flee. The road was still there, patient and wide. For once, she wasn't running toward it. The apron felt stiff around Elaine's waist, unfamiliar but grounding. Her feet ached within the first hour, protesting years of gentler routines. Orders blurred together, coffee spilled, and she apologized more than necessary. Still, no one yelled, and no one sent her away. That alone felt like a small mercy. The rhythm of work slowly took over her thoughts. Refill, wipe, listen, move, repeat. There was comfort in tasks that asked only for presence. Her mind, usually crowded with regret, had less room to wander. For stretches of time, she simply existed. During a brief break, she leaned against the counter and breathed deeply. Her body was tired in an honest way, muscles warmed by effort. This tiredness didn't feel like defeat. It felt earned, like proof she was still capable. That realization made her stand a little straighter. A customer thanked her for the refill, meeting her eyes briefly. "Have a good day," he said, meaning it. Elaine nodded, surprised by the spark of connection. Such a small exchange, yet it anchored her. She was useful, if only for a moment. As the shift dragged on, doubt crept back in quietly. Was this really her life now? Clearing tables at 52, the thought stung, but it didn't crush her. She reminded herself that breathing came before dreaming. Survival wasn't failure, it was foundation. When the shift ended, her hands smelled like soap and coffee. The manager handed her a few bills and tomorrow's schedule. Elaine stared at the paper longer than necessary. Tomorrow implied continuity, and continuity implied permission to exist. Her chest tightened with something dangerously close to gratitude. She walked back to her car slower than usual. The day had taken something from her, but it had also given something back. Not hope yet, but rhythm, and rhythm mattered. She sat in the driver's seat and exhaled fully. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. Elaine washed her hands in the diner's bathroom before leaving. The mirror above the sink was cracked at the corner, imperfect and honest. She looked at herself longer than comfort allowed. Her face was flushed, hair messy, eyes tired but alert. She didn't look defeated, just unfinished. She leaned closer, studying details she'd avoided for years. The fine lines near her eyes told stories of endurance, not failure. Her shoulders, though slumped, still carried quiet strength. She realized she had survived things she once thought impossible. That fact changed how she saw herself. "You're still here," she whispered, meeting her own gaze. The words didn't sound hollow this time. They sounded like recognition. Not pride, not celebration, but acknowledgement. And acknowledgement felt powerful. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. Elaine squinted, adjusting to the light like someone newly awake. The world looked the same, but she felt slightly altered within it, as if something inside her had shifted position. Not healed, but realigned. She sat in her car and didn't start it immediately. Instead, she rested her hands on her lap and breathed. Fear was still there, waiting patiently, but it shared space now with something else, a growing sense of self she could no longer ignore. Elaine thought about the woman she had been, and the woman she was becoming. They weren't enemies, she realized. They were parts of the same long story, a story that hadn't ended at the divorce or the parking lot, a story still being written, one honest day at a time. As she turned the key and pulled onto the road, her reflection caught her once more. She didn't look away. She held her own gaze, steady and calm. Something had answered her from that mirror. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the road. That night, Elaine sat in her car, longer than usual, engine off, lights dimmed. The parking lot was quieter now, emptied of its daytime urgency and judgment. She rested her head against the seat and felt the weight of the day settle in her bones. Work had tired her body, but it had awakened something deeper. And that awakening demanded a conversation she had avoided for years. She spoke softly at first, as if afraid someone might overhear her truth. "I didn't leave because I was weak," she said, into the dark. The words trembled, unfamiliar in her mouth, but they didn't disappear. They stayed, echoing gently, asking to be continued. Elaine swallowed and forced herself not to retreat. She talked about the marriage, not with anger, but with clarity. About how she had folded herself smaller to keep peace. About how love slowly became duty, then silence, then loneliness. She admitted her fear of being alone had once felt stronger than self-respect. Saying it out loud hurt, but it also felt clean. Then she turned the lens inward, where the hardest truths lived. She confessed how she had ignored her own voice for decades, how she had mistaken endurance for purpose and sacrifice for worth. Tears came, not dramatic, but steady, like rain that nourishes the ground. She let them fall without apology. "I abandoned myself," she whispered, hands gripping the steering wheel. The sentence landed heavily, but it didn't crush her. Instead, it explained everything she hadn't known how to name. The exhaustion, the numbness, the quiet resentment toward her own life. Understanding didn't erase pain, but it softened its edges. Elaine took a long breath and felt something release inside her chest. This wasn't forgiveness yet, not fully, but it was honesty. And honesty felt like the first solid ground she'd touched in a long time. She realized she didn't need to punish herself anymore to prove she cared. She had already paid enough. As she lay back and closed her eyes, the night felt less threatening. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had lost its sharpest teeth. She had faced herself and survived the encounter. That alone changed the shape of tomorrow. And tomorrow, for the first time, felt possible. Morning arrived with a pale sky and the smell of dust and coffee. Elaine stretched slowly, muscles sore but cooperative. Her body remembered work now, remembered purpose in small doses. She sat upright and stared through the windshield, mind unusually clear, clear enough to begin imagining something beyond today. The plan didn't come as inspiration, but as practicality. More shifts at the diner, saving what she could, one envelope at a time. Asking Curtis about rooms for rent, even if the thought embarrassed her. Looking up community classes on the library computer after work. Nothing glamorous, nothing cinematic, just steps that could be taken. She wrote the ideas on a receipt with a borrowed pen. The paper felt thin, temporary, but the words mattered. Each line was proof she hadn't given up on herself. She folded the receipt carefully and placed it in her wallet. A fragile map, but hers. Doubt arrived immediately, as it always did. Who was she to plan anything at 52, starting from almost nothing? The voice of old limitations whispered that she was already too late. Elaine closed her eyes and listened without obeying. She had learned the difference now. She reminded herself that perfection was never the goal. Stability would come later, maybe slowly, maybe unevenly. Right now, survival with dignity was enough. Movement mattered more than certainty, and progress didn't need permission to begin. At the diner, she worked with more confidence than the day before. Her hands remembered the rhythm faster, her apologies fewer. The manager nodded at her once, a small sign of approval. Elaine felt a quiet pride she didn't rush to dismiss. Small wins deserved to be acknowledged. That night, back in her car, she reread the receipt. It didn't promise happiness, but it promised direction, and direction felt like oxygen to a woman who had been drifting. She tucked it away and rested her head back. For the first time, she slept without bracing for impact. A week passed, measured in shifts, coffee refills, and aching feet. Elaine grew used to the routine, even grateful for it. The parking lot no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a temporary harbor before something else. That distinction mattered more than she expected. Curtis mentioned a small room above his cousin's garage. Cheap, nothing fancy, but dry and safe. Elaine hesitated before answering, old pride rising up instinctively. Then she caught herself and breathed through it. "Yes," she said, voice steady, surprising them both. Packing the car took less time than she imagined. There wasn't much to gather, but each item carried weight. The receipt plan, her recipe cards, a clean change of clothes. She paused before closing the trunk, feeling the gravity of leaving, not fleeing, but choosing. She drove out of the lot slowly, not from fear, but intention. The gas station disappeared behind her, smaller with each mile. That place had witnessed her at her lowest. It had also witnessed her first steps upward. She honored it by remembering both. At a stoplight, Elaine noticed her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, yes, but also present. No longer hollow, no longer invisible to herself. She realized she wasn't erasing the past by moving forward. She was carrying it with wisdom instead of shame. The room above the garage smelled like oil and dust. It wasn't home yet, but it wasn't the car either. Elaine set her bag down and stood still for a moment. The silence felt different here, less hostile, like a pause instead of an ending. That night, lying on a real bed, she stared at the ceiling. Fear still visited, but it didn't dominate the room. She wasn't escaping her life anymore. She was entering it cautiously, honestly, and that made all the difference. Weeks later, Elaine drove the highway again, but this time, by choice. The road stretched wide and familiar, no longer a refuge of desperation. Sunlight poured through the windshield, warming her hands on the wheel. She was heading to a community center orientation an hour away. A small step, but one that mattered deeply to her. She thought about the mural she once painted, the joy of shared creation. Teaching art wouldn't fix everything, but it felt like alignment, a return to something authentic she had buried for survival. The idea scared her in the right way, fear mixed with excitement instead of paralysis. As the miles passed, she noticed how differently she breathed. Not shallow, not rushed, but steady. Her body trusted her a little more now. She trusted herself enough to keep going. That mutual trust felt new and fragile. At a rest stop, she stepped out and stretched beneath the open sky. The wind tugged at her hair, playful and insistent. Elaine laughed softly, surprised by the sound. It felt like meeting an old friend unexpectedly, herself, returning. She remembered the woman asleep in a car weeks ago. The fear, the shame, the disbelief that life could still hold meaning. She didn't judge that version of herself anymore. She honored her for surviving long enough to change. Survival had been the bridge, not the destination. When she arrived, the building looked ordinary, unremarkable. But inside, possibility waited quietly. Elaine signed her name on a clipboard without hesitation. The pen felt steady in her hand. She was no longer asking permission to begin. Driving back, the road felt like a partner, not an escape. It carried her forward without demanding she forget where she came from. Fear still rode along, but it sat quietly now. Courage had taken the front seat, and Elaine let it drive. Elaine stood at the edge of her small room one evening, window open. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted in, ordinary and grounding. She held her recipe cards, flipping through familiar handwriting. Memories rose, not as pain, but as texture. Her life, layered and real. She thought about re-beginning, how misleading the word could be. This wasn't a return to youth or lost opportunity. It was a continuation, shaped by everything she had endured. She didn't need to erase the past to move forward. She needed to include it with honesty. At the diner, she had become a fixture, trusted and steady. At the community center, she was learning again, slowly and humbly. Neither role defined her completely. They were pieces, not cages, and that realization felt liberating. One evening, she caught her reflection in a store window. She stopped, really looked, and smiled gently. The woman staring back wasn't perfect or fearless, but she was awake, and awake was enough. Elaine understood now that starting over didn't mean starting empty. She carried wisdom, scars, patience, and compassion. Things youth never gave her. Her second beginning was quieter, but deeper, rooted instead of rushed. She walked home beneath a sky streaked with fading light. The road behind her was long, the road ahead uncertain, but she belonged to both. She had learned to choose herself without abandoning others. That balance felt like freedom. As she unlocked her door, Elaine paused, hand on the knob. She breathed in, steady and calm. Life hadn't given her a miracle. It had given her another morning. And this time, she was ready to live it.